After you've done with creating all the mechanics for your rig, the next thing is to actually create custom bone shapes. Custom bone shapes will help keep things usable and clean and much faster for the animator. And when you combine this with color groups and grouping bones together in layers, it can really make things look neat and tidy. Here are some of the thoughts I have when I create some custom bone shapes. They shouldn't get in the way of the character because the animator needs to see what's going on in the screen without it being obscured, and it should be somewhat logical to the task it performs. However, if that shape becomes ugly or distracting, it's best to choose a clean and simple shape because animators will figure out what the control does, so you don't need to overcomplicate the shapes. For example, this foot roll here is kind of this half moon circle shape. It rotates up in this direction. But over here, we've got a toe pivot, which also rotates in a similar way, but it does also go on all three axes. Now, I've chosen deliberately to choose just a circle here rather than a sphere shape to keep things tidy. If it was a sphere shape, it would take up too much space and clog the view all the time. Now, a custom shape is just another object that's used to display in place of the bone. You can actually use most of the other objects in Blender to create a custom shape. There's just a few exceptions that you can't use. Now, if you want to use a curve as a custom shape, there's actually a few workarounds to get it to work because it doesn't work out of the box. You can create a bevel or add a modifier to it, and then it will show up. However, most people just use mesh objects, and this is what I would recommend too. Now let's talk about naming conventions. And as we've spoken about earlier, this is just the name that we give to our objects so that you can recognize what it is. Now there's many different naming conventions that you can choose. Here are some of the ones that I've seen here. They'll be short for widget or custom shape, bone shape, or gizmo. I'm sure there's others. I actually prefer the widget, spelled WDGT. That's my prefix that I like to add to my shapes, because to me, that looks like the abbreviation of widget. Whereas the WGT just looks like Wiget to me, and that really freaks me out. But you can call your Wigets whatever you like. So how do we enable these custom bone shapes on your actual controls? But first here, I've got a really simple scene going on. I've got an armature with 3 bones. I've turned on the axes here, and these first 2 bones are aligned with the world, where the Z-axis is pointing up, Y-axis is pointing backwards, and the X-axis is pointing to the right. Whereas this bone here is in its default orientation, where the Y-axis is pointing up, Z is forward, and X is to the right. And it is also twice the size of these other bones. So these bones go 1 Blender unit in the world Y space, and this bone here goes 2 Blender units in the world Z space. And then I have a couple of arrows over here, which are just mesh objects. We have an arrow that is going 1 Blender unit in the Z axis. This one here goes 1 Blender unit in the Y axis. And this one goes 2 Blender units in the Y axis. How do we get these shapes to apply to our bones here? Well, that's really simple. We just jump into pose mode, select whatever bone that we want to add our shape to, jump over to our bone tab, and down here we have viewport display. And then under the custom shape, you can see our custom object here. So we can click in here and choose whatever object that we want. There we go. To clear it, we can just click this X. Another way of adding it is using the eyedropper, and we can choose it from the viewport or the outliner up here. So that is another way of adding it there. We can actually apply the same shape to multiple bones at once, but we can't actually use the eyedropper for this. But if we just click in here and hold down the Alt key, we can choose whatever shape that we want, and it will apply to all the bones that we have selected. So I'm going to choose the Y arrow small. Bang! And you'll notice that those ones are actually pointing in the right direction. So why are these 2 pointing in the correct direction and this one is pointing in the wrong direction? Just clear this shape so you can see the default bone. And now when we add a shape, the origin of our shape gets placed at the head of the bone, and then 1 Blender unit in the Y direction will be the tail of the bone. So that is this direction. You can see here with this arrow, it doesn't go in the Y direction, it actually goes in the Z direction, which is why the arrow was pointing in the wrong direction. If we have a look at our good arrow over here, and then jump into edit mode, this vertex at the end is exactly 1 Blender unit away from our origin here on the Y axis. So that means here will be the head of our bone, and this vertex will be the tail. And that is why these 2 shapes match up perfectly. Let's see if we can actually fix this one. We add our bad shape, and then try and fix our shape. So I'm going to select it, then jump into edit mode, and then I already have my cursor at the origin here. I'm going to rotate all the geometry. So RX, whoops, I want to rotate around the 3D cursor, RX, and then this way, -90, enter. And then you saw that that actually updated our shape here. So now I have fixed all my shapes. There's a few more settings to explain. So we actually have the scale option, so we can actually scale the shape up and down if we like. Now this setting, scale to bone length, is enabled by default, and this setting is why the shape is stretched along the whole length of the bone. If we disable it, it's not actually going to scale it along the bone length anymore. It's going to use the object scale. So that means it's only going to go one Blender unit in the Y direction, which is only halfway up our bone, because the length is actually 2 Blender units. So with this option disabled, you either need to scale this one bigger to match, or you can choose a shape that is already the correct scale. Here's one I prepared earlier. Ta-da! Now you might find all this scale a little bit confusing. So here is what I would suggest. Leave your scale at 1, always have this scale to bone length enabled, and then make your shapes 1 Blender unit long in the Y direction. That way, you're always going to get perfect shapes. This option here says Override Transform. And this means we can display this shape here at another bone's location. This is very handy in many situations. So we can click in here and then say, we want this shape to display at bone number 1. Boom. So now if we move the location of this, it's always going to follow. And this is very handy in rigging, although there's one thing to point out, it's only displaying in this location. If we rotate and move this around, it's actually not changing the pivot point or anything of this bone. It's just changing the place where it's displayed. Now, just to reiterate this, I'm going to bring up my rotation tool, and you can see that my pivot point is still over here. Now, if we rotate this one around, it is actually rotating, you can see up here, but the way it's visually displayed is being overridden by this bone here. Now, this might seem like a silly thing to do, but you can actually use it quite well. For example, here is a camera dolly rig which ships with Blender. And if I move this camera control around, you'll notice that it always points towards the aim target here. And if I move the aim target around, it's always pointing at the camera. Now, how is this possible without creating a dependency cycle? Well, the answer is to override the transforms. So let's turn on all my layers here. So I've just got a hidden layer and this special bone here. This is just a mechanism bone, which happens to be parented to our aim control. So it's going to follow along wherever you move it. But this constraint is always going to copy the rotation of our camera here. So that means wherever you put it, it's always going to be pointing towards our target. And then if we have a look at the aim control here, and under viewport displays, you can see it's just using a custom shape, which is that aim widget. But the transforms are being overridden by that mechanism control. If I turn this off and then move it around, you notice that our aim control isn't rotating at all. It's just an optical illusion. And this would be an excellent use of the override transforms. Now the final setting is this wireframe option here. Let me just enable this custom shape, and you can see my bone is now a cube. So when we turn on the wireframe, it's going to ignore all the faces of your custom shape and just show the wireframe. I prefer to always have this enabled because the wireframe option is never going to occlude your mesh and get in the way. So that's pretty much it for custom bone shapes. But now you're probably thinking, geez, it's pretty difficult and a lot of work to create custom bone shapes. And you'd be correct. And that's why I use the Bone Widget add-on to help with all this. Now I'll include a link in the description. It was originally created by Christophe Sue for Blender 2.7. However, I have been doing my own development of this over the last year or so and made it work with Blender 2.8 Plus. I've also added some handy features that I wanted to see in the tool. Now it's free and it's open source, and it's designed to help speed things up by keeping things organized, aligning all the shapes to match the bones. And it also has a bunch of time-saving tools, like the ability to mirror shapes from one side to the other, which is very handy. However, having said all this, it's important to note that CG Cookie does not give technical support on this add-on. This is something that I am developing in my spare time, and I've made freely available to all. So there are a few known bugs, which I'll sort out when I have time. But let me say this one more time. CG Cookie does not provide technical support for this add-on. This tool does work and it saves me a bunch of time. So maybe it can save you a bunch of time too.